Okay, we'll go ahead and wait maybe one more minute, wait for a few more people to join, and then we can go ahead and start the presentation. So, now can everybody hear okay? Is there any problem with any kind of audio issues or? Now, Esther, you can still hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Now, if you're having any issues with audio, just make sure you click on that little button that says Connect Computer to Audio, and it should get you hooked up to our audio feed. Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and start. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm Michael Molina. I'm with the Oklahoma Transportation Library and the Southern Plains Transportation Center. And this is our inaugural webinar that we're doing. We're going to have a few more webinars in the future, so stay tuned for those. We'll be emailing those out later. But our presenter today is Dr. Esther Mullens from the South Central Climate Science Center. And the way we're going to have this set up, we're going to go through the presentation first and then have a question and answer session afterwards. So if you have like a microphone, you can, say your question, or there should be a little chat box you can type your question into, and that'll be after the presentation. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Mullens, and we can start the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining this lunchtime. This is actually my first webinar. So in my mind, I had it as sort of me talking by myself to a computer screen, which I have done in fairness, but not for a whole hour. So I really appreciate you joining me today. A bit about me. I am a postdoc researcher. My background is in atmospheric science and meteorology. I realized fairly early on I'm not of the technical mindset to do engineering, but it's been a really fun few years as I've learned an awful lot about transportation side of things. But today I'm going to present some information about some of our regional climate trends, and I call that a climate trends roadmap for transportation. Let me see. There we go. I'd like to thank a number of people that have helped with this. So what I'm going to present has really been a collaborative effort amongst a few different organizations here. Of course, the Southern Plains Transportation Center has lent their expertise and insights as we've gone through this work. Other folks at the South Central Climate Science Center and the Southern Climate Impact Planning Program, which is another group here in Norman that deals with climate issues, and the OU School of Meteorology. So I'm sure that we're all familiar with the fact that weather and climate can impact transportation. It may not necessarily be the number one thing we think of if we're sort of going about our day-to-day work in that sector, but just a few things. Design, for example, almost everything that we do is underpinned by climate, particularly as our infrastructure is perennially exposed to weather and climate throughout its lifetime. So here's just a few examples. Rainfall is used when we consider drainage and flooding issues, along with other factors such as the land surface. When dealing with road surfaces, you need to know about the maximum potential temperature you get at that surface or below that surface, in hot conditions, in traffic conditions, and also extremely cold conditions. And also in bridge design, the issues of solar radiation and unequal temperature gradients across the bridge structure. In maintenance, we deal with the exposure to weather and climate, responding to that as it's happening, and also after the event has occurred. So here's just a few examples: extreme heat, working outside in that, and snow and ice, results from severe winter weather and freeze-thaw cycles, and also flooding. So this bottom figure that you see here is actually from eastern Oklahoma in 2015, when severe flooding led to erosion that road and produced those enormous cracks that you see there. And then for the rest of us, just general society has to kind of, who uses the transportation network, the issues of safety come in when we think of wildfires, dust storms, road closures and diversions, tracks dealing with extreme heat or extreme cold and icing. I believe that picture of those cars all over the place is from the Atlanta area a few years ago when they had an unusual episode of winter weather. And then, of course, in everyone's minds last year, Hurricane Harvey and the impacts of flooding in the Houston area. So with all of that, we know, if we've lived in Oklahoma or anywhere in the Southern Plains, we've dealt with almost every type of extreme you could imagine. In fact, I used to joke to people back in England, where I'm from, that really the only thing we don't tend to get is a volcanic eruption, but almost everything else we deal with. So climate variability, extreme weather is something that people have a lot of experience with. So over the years, we may have a big flood or ice storms or heat waves or cold waves. All these things can happen. But generally, for a lot of us, we just assume throughout our life that the climate that we started with is the climate that we're going to end with. That's assuming that we live in the same location that I do, which is move to a completely different climate. So this is just an example of climate variability, these ups and downs, these wiggles in our temperature trend or our precipitation trend just indicate that our climate system varies, and we can have some very extreme conditions as part of that. So with the assumption of a stationary climate, then we can look in the past and we can look at past extreme conditions, and those can help inform the types of drainage that we need, the types of infrastructure design parameters. However, what if our climate is not stationary? What if there's a trend that is occurring? That rather changes the situation. In some cases, we may be better off, maybe less cold conditions, but in other areas we may find ourselves having issues or seeing extremes in the types of frequencies or magnitudes that we've not previously encountered them. And in that condition, assuming a non-stationary climate, it's not as, we can't necessarily take what we've seen in the past and apply it to the future as well. So this is a quote that I've used before, and I quite like it. I don't actually know who it's by. Whoever this person is, it's a nice quote. And he just says, the greatest danger in times of turbulence is to act with yesterday's logic. And I change that a little bit, and I say the greatest danger in times of climate change is to act only with yesterday's climate. Now, that may be a little bit hyperbole in a sense. It's not climate is not the only thing we have to consider in engineering or in anything really, but if we have a climate that isn't the same in the future as it was in the past, then acting only with our past climate is not going to tell us the full story when we get into the future. And this is particularly true when you look at long duration and very high value infrastructure that's designed to be there for a long period of time. If anyone's interested, this picture comes from my father, who was a transportation planner in the UK, and I have no idea how the bus ended up in that hole, but it makes for a good picture. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room. When we think of climate change, it's one of those words now that, like politics and religion, it's hard to bring up those types of things at the dinner table unless you know the people very, very well. And even then, it's become a highly politicized subject, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. I know that there's a lot of implications if the climate is changing, what that means for society, for regulation, and things like that. However, I'm presenting what I understand from my experience and my professional expertise. I'm assuming that if you're listening, you have some basic understanding of climate change and its causes. However, please feel free to talk to me offline if you'd like some more information on that. So as we were going about our project, the main area that we were tackling was really just one particular step in I'm getting some feedback. Anyone? Oops, I think it's gone.
Okay, yeah, that sounds better.
Okay. All right. So the Federal Highways Administration has been doing a lot of work in recent years to help transportation agencies recognize the impacts of climate variability and climate change and to build resilience. Our particular part of that was just this first step, know your vulnerabilities. And we were tackling that from the climate angle. So that's really only part of the step. The other part of the step comes to how those climate trends impact specific assets. But our mission was to provide transportation relevant climate trends at the regional level for each state in the SPTC Region 6. So that's 5 states, and to make this information accessible. And I will show you in a minute what that is, what that looks like. And a no less important aim was to get a conversation started. So this is still an emerging topic. There are obviously a lot of standards and design parameters that are specific to transportation agencies, and incorporating new information may not be all that easy. It's just, you know, learning about this information, talking across disciplines. So ultimately, how we as climate folk and engineering folk and in various subsectors can help each other with these types of problems. So the way that we tackle our know your vulnerabilities was obviously we did a research project a few years ago, and you know, out of that you create a nice document, a final report, and you know, you spend a lot of time creating it, and then it typically goes and sits somewhere. And you know, I like to write a lot, so then I realized, you know, I didn't even want to read what I'd written. So we took that information and broke it down into the different states. In each of these, we look at various things that were considered to be important based on some information we gathered from transportation professionals in the region. I'm going to go through what these summaries will look like. Using the Oklahoma State summary as an example. I'm sorry if you can't see all of this information all that well. These are just screenshots of the pages from the document itself. I'm going to really bring out the major points for each, so that you don't need to worry about reading through everything that's on here. So we formatted these to consider basically the same types of climate information across each of these states, and using, when possible, some sub-regional information. So we've got our state-level trends and projections, and then we use smaller regions within that. Variables that we consider include winter, weather such as freezing and thawing, winter, whether it's snow and ice. We also then tend to look at heat, at drought, and extreme precipitation as well, and we bring in case studies of historical events in the region and historical extremes. We then have a resources section that talks about some current information and websites and resources available from the transportation community that specifically looks at climate. And then an appendix which addresses more technical information, such as what data sets we used to create trends. So if you don't have a lot of time, obviously the executive summary is the main place to start. It's just a single page, talks about why we did it, why it's important, and what kinds of results we got for each individual state. and that's at the very bottom of this first page. So if you go as far as that, you kind of get the gist. But then we present our evidence for our claims, within the subsequent document. For each summary, we consider a number of different sectors in transportation, just in a broad approach, which considers the scope of the transportation network in each state, and then these icons that highlight different, so roads or trains, cars, bridges. We also consider things like drainage, so the types of lifetimes associated with that, the capacity, and any weather-related stresses, that then bring that around to show you why these types of things have some sensitivity to weather or climate impact. So we use those icons in the different parts of the document to indicate what types of weather or climate trend they could potentially be impacted by. We consider the historical climate of the region and some of the recent trends. So just in general, all of this information is laid out to be accessible. It's not overly technical. Included a number of citations to other resources. So we talk about what Oklahoma's climate is, what the trends have recently been, and then bring in some information such as what have we been seeing in terms of the historical extremes. So here, for example, this figure at the bottom shows billion-dollar weather disasters that have impacted the state of Oklahoma in the past 30 years. And what's interesting here is you can see that in recent years there's been an uptick in billion-dollar disasters in the region associated with severe storms, for example. We can't say whether or not that's an atmospheric things such as increases in those types of events, or whether it's due to more social economic issues such as growing population. But in general, you see there's some vulnerabilities there. A section addresses how we determined what information to use. So we did conduct a survey back in late 2015. I had a number of participants, and in that survey we wanted to know about the types of weather and climate variables that are particularly of interest, the threshold for that information, such as like with heat, for example, what would be considered adverse heat. And that obviously varies depending on where you are in the region, but in general there were some commonalities. So this word map here just indicates some of the variables that were considered to be most of interest. And since it was 2015 and we were coming out of a very wet year, rainfall and flooding was very high up there. But you also see just, again, hot, cold, snow and ice, and things like that. So those are all ones we got in this document. We look at some general thresholds, such as with heat, 100 degrees tended to be a cutoff between what would be considered okay versus not so okay. But again, it kind of depended. Down in Louisiana in Arkansas, 95 degrees is a little bit more common as a threshold for very hot conditions. Cold, snowfall and rainfall, also we looked at some thresholds. Rainfall was a little bit more mixed, and it really did depend on the type of problem that people were addressing, whether or not they were interested in a fixed threshold, such as a 2-inch event in a day, or a return period. We ended up looking at return periods. And then we also provide just a little bit of information about why we didn't consider things like tornadoes, and simply the data that we were using does not have the ability to resolve that type of information. This is an example of one particular type of climate trend. So we typically lay these over 2 or 3 pages that deal with the past conditions and then the future projected conditions based on the climate models that we were using. And we were using multiple climate models. And that is, again, I won't go into that at this time, but a lot of that information is available in the final report for this project. And I will show you where you can find that, and also in the appendix of each one of these summaries, there's some information on the specific climate information we were using. So we start with historical trends, or what's notable about each state. So for example, with Oklahoma, we find that snowfall is more common in the northern half of the state. And then as you head south, the winter weather that you typically see is more of the ice and sleet mix. Winter precipitation has not shown much of a trend. It's generally been very highly variable. Some years you see a lot and some years you won't see any. But in the decade of 2000 to 2010, Oklahoma experienced a number of disruptive winter storms, as I'm sure those of you who are in Oklahoma can recall, a number of very damaging ice storms. So this is kind of the historical kind of status quo, as it were, like what we have experienced. Then as we move ahead, so this is the information now that's coming from the climate models. And so these pages are laid out at the top just to show the salient points. So typically, whether something is increasing or decreasing in the future, the types of percentage increases or decreases that we are seeing, then any caveats about data, any information about the data that could be pertinent, and then how this could impact transportation just in a general sense. And then a confidence estimate, and so I'll talk about confidence a little later on. This figure, I'm just going to go through this. So as part of this document, we do have a page that talks about climate modeling, what that means just in general, and how climate models differ from weather models. And we also introduced this idea of emission scenarios, which describe kind of potential future pathways in greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades and centuries. So we have some MR here and then H. There are two emission scenarios we looked at. Mid-range and high is what I designate them as. Mid-range, in general, depicts a pathway where we emit greenhouse gases that continue to increase throughout at least the mid-21st century and thereafter. The various, they don't really specify necessarily the reasons, but the expectation in that scenario would be that we'd level off and then gradually decline after that to the late 21st century. So that's called mid-range. High is if you took the kinds of emissions that we're currently producing and you just continue to grow that out through the 21st century, that would be a high emission scenario. We lay this spatial information out as this 4-panel, and this is basically the average of all the models that we use. There's two time periods, a kind of a mid-century time period, the next 30-odd years, and then a later century. So for many of us with shorter timelines, the mid-century perhaps is going to be of more interest. But then for certain types of long-duration infrastructure, we may even want to see what's out beyond that. So you see here that this is a percentage change in the frequency of winter weather as resolved by climate models relative to a 1971 to 2000 mean. And so in the mid-century period, the difference between these two emission scenarios isn't all that large. You can generally see, as you might expect, if we are in a warmer climate situation, less overall winter weather. In the latter part of the century, you begin to see the differences appearing, in particular with high emissions, there's a higher decrease in winter weather. Now, this doesn't say anything about intensity, and what we tended to find is that intensity doesn't really change, it's the frequency that does. So winter storms in the future could still be intense, just not necessarily as frequent. Another thing that we do in these summaries is to look at sub-regions. So this is an example of future heat in central Oklahoma. And central Oklahoma is defined as Oklahoma Climate Division 5. So I'm just going to click forward for a second. If you're not familiar with climate divisions, these are geographical regions within each state that denote a similar climate in general. It gets a little bit more complicated when you're in topographically diverse regions such as New Mexico. But in trying to determine a sub-region to consider, you could go down to the county level, but then you have data coming out of your ears, so it's just a little easier to look at these types of domains, not to mention so many variables what you see in terms of the trend for the whole domain is more than likely what you're going to see if you were to go down to the level of a county or even a city, which they can do. But anyway, we look at Oklahoma Climate Division 5. And so this information here, a time series. So for example, for maximum temperature, maximum annual temperature in the year, we pick that and indicate that goes up, for example, by up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit later in the century. That in that time series on the top, you see a range, and that range is to do with all the different models that we look at. We also try and bring in some sort of historically relevant information. So if you have lived and worked in central Oklahoma or any part of Oklahoma for a while, you might remember the summer of 2011, where we had a significant drought and also just significant heat. And so if you take a year like that and then you look in the model data at how common that year might be looking out into the future, that's one way to kind of give you a sense of what these future conditions may look like. So for example here, based on the average of all the models we looked at, you see that by 2040 that type of year could occur once every 30 years, and given that in the historical period it never had occurred in over 100 years of record, that is indeed an increase. And then you really see by the mid-century that if you're with the high emissions pathway, that this type of year becomes increasingly the normal type of year by later in the century. And we use two different emissions pathways because honestly, we don't know what path people are going to take in the future, and so having more than one pathway kind of gets you to see where the potential lies for different types of future trends. Finally, we look at heavy precipitation, and this is just, again, another example of bringing out some sub-regional information. There's just a ton of information here, so I'm not going to expect you to immediately want to read all that. But ultimately, what we did see from the models in general was an increase in the frequency of extreme rainfall. What we did with the precipitation data on the climate division level was to extract the highest precipitation for a given year and then look at extreme value theory, so using extreme value distributions to get return periods for that using daily data. And so we were able to resolve like the 100-year rainfall, for example. However, the actual magnitude of that really does depend a lot on the extreme value distribution that you use. And so we used two different types. One that was a little bit more conservative, which is the Gumbel extreme value distribution, and another one, the generalized extreme value distribution. And so, yeah, basically we talk a little bit about some of the uncertainty with that, but resolving, for example, the historical 100-year storm, so what we currently think of as a 100-year event, and then looking outward into the future and how much the potential expected frequency could increase or decrease with that overall. By the mid or late 21st century, that type of event becomes about 3 or 4 times more frequent statistically. The interesting thing about this was there was less of a dependency on the emissions pathway and more of a dependency on which model you used in terms of how extreme the expected future precipitation could be. The last section in each one of these documents is generally the same, although we try and bring in a case study of some type of activity in each state or in a nearby state if there's not one available for that state that looks at how climate information has been incorporated into some sort of adaptation or resiliency study. So here we just kind of highlight why we do this, why. So again, historical data may not capture what we might experience in the future. We then lay out some resources that are available, so different groups, different agencies have all tackled climate to some degree in the past or currently. And so each one of these is active links in the document that allows you to go to those websites and look at those resources. We talk a little bit about the Federal Highways Administration pilot studies, which went on from 2010 through about 2015. I believe there's another call now for proposals to look at resiliency against weather extremes. And so there are various different parts of the country that looked at that and tried to collect climate information. We include some resources, and the main resources that we included are ones that were developed by transportation agencies. So obviously the project that we did here did output a number of data sets. Given some of the specific requirements, so if, for example, standards and things like that, there are some other resources that you may want to consider. So the Federal Highways Administration has a number of those, and those are linked here as well. Finally, since again this is an emerging area, one of the things that if anyone has some sort of interest in looking at climate, particularly future climate, but also historical climate and extremes in the historical period, then places like the South Central Climate Science Center and the Southern Climate Impact Planning Program have a number of folks that would be very interested to talk to you about that. We have access to a lot of information, a lot of data sets, if that's what you're interested in. And finally, our appendix, if you want to get more technical information, such as exactly what climate models we used and where they are, things like that, that's all in there. This confidence estimate that we use across the document is based on, in general, on an approach used by the National Climate Assessment, which is a large document that comes out every 4 years. The next one is expected actually this year. And so we have high, medium, low. And sometimes it's a little difficult to exactly specify whether something's medium or low, so we use typically like, well, medium, low, or medium, high. Generally, considering whether the models agree on the direction of change, whether there's a lot of supporting evidence in the literature, in other studies that agree on the direction of change, whether the methods have large or low uncertainties and things like that, goes into whether or not something is considered high, medium, or low confidence. So finally, I have a few, these are just questions that I thought people might ask. So let's see, where can I get these documents? So we just released a project website, and I believe this PowerPoint is going to get saved, so if anyone's interested, then please just go back and look to the PowerPoint, or you can write it down now. That website just provides an overview of the project, and then there's a tab called State Summaries, and you can go to each one of the 5 states in the region and download the PDF, the full PDF of these summaries for your region. For some people, if they're in Texas and Louisiana, coastal issues are extremely important in those areas. We did not specifically analyze sea level rise in any of the data that we're looking at, but we did provide some resources and further reading for the Texas and Louisiana state summaries. If you're interested in data sets or graphics using this work, so anything from these PDFs, any one of those graphics you can use. There is a suggested citation. You can pretty much anything you can use for your own interest or in any projects, or if you just want to kind of tell your friends, that kind of thing. So we're populating a basic data portal with graphics and data sets. And when I say basic, I really do mean basic. I'm actually going to show you right now. We expect to have a lot of that data in the next few months. So here it is. There's just simple file list. So data, figures, and then the final project available up there as well in Word format. But I will provide a full kind of user guide to that, because I mean, I'd love to be able to build a really nice portal, but it's unfortunately not going to happen. This is what the website looks like. And again, if you go to state summaries, you click down, and then you can download the full report here if you're interested. So you can drag and drop it back. There we go. Okay, that is all for me. Thank you very much. If you are interested in this line of work and you want to provide any feedback to those resources, I would be happy to hear it. Here is my contact information. I will be transitioning to another institution later this year, so there are 2 email addresses available there. The Gmail one would be after August of this year. Thank you for your time.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Esther. And are there any questions for Dr. Mullens? If you're hooked up with a microphone, you can feel free to ask any questions, or you can also use the chat box in your in the WebEx platform. Was someone trying to say something? I could barely hear something. All right. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Mullens. I appreciate your time and appreciate everybody for participating. So we'll go ahead and send a link out to this presentation. We'll post it on our website, and we'll attach the PowerPoint too if anyone's interested in that. So yeah, if anyone has any questions after the fact, feel free to email Dr. Mullens or myself about anything. And just thanks again for participating, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.